Loving our neighbor is about serving our neighbor. Hello, neighbors. Mr. Rogers and His Neighborhood was on PBS from 1968 to 2001. You may not have been around when he got started, but you are likely to know of Mr. Rogers, and you may have even seen the legacy of his brainchild, Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, a reimagination of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood that my grandchildren watch to this day. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was a magical place of love and community that introduced children to the wonders of the world. Somehow, though, in real life, without the luxury of paid actors, scripts, and puppets, being neighborly and engaging with those we don't yet know can be way more intimidating, difficult, and even exhausting. This Advent, as we turn our focus on love, a product from our hope in Christ, we have to ask ourselves, what exactly does it mean to love our neighbor? Well, first, let's look in Matthew 5:14 through 16. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Let's break this down. Let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. You can hear Kingship's values playing out through this passage: to activate into the kingdom, to gather in a community of believers and become active in the city on the hill, to equip and to be equipped, and in turn to reactivate and activate others, all swirling around the central goal and purpose, which is to glorify God. They may see your good works. What are these good works then that will be seen and lead to the glorifying of God? First, here's what they are not. When Jesus refers to good works, it's not about getting you noticed. Jesus gives us clarity in Matthew again when he is asked by the religious leaders, in this case a lawyer, to identify the most important law. Matthew 22:34 through 40. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, what is the great commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. With his answer, Jesus is summarizing the 10 Commandments, and this gives us insight into the good works referenced in Matthew 5. Our good works, which spring forth from Christ in our lives as our only true hope, are captured in these two expressions of love. One, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And two, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus was purposeful in putting these two commandments together as they are interconnected. And the interplay and expression of these commands will make up the good works referenced in Matthew 5. When we think of who constitutes our neighbor, think about this. That guy playing Xbox online with you, or the single mother who's got 2 kids and is trying to restart her life next door to your life, or that annoying coworker that keeps asking you questions, or the friend that's not really that close who keeps texting you asking you for favors. They all showed up in your life completely unannounced. They just rolled square into the middle of your world, and no one even consulted you. As G.K. Chesterton once observed, we make our friends and we make our enemies, but God makes our next door neighbor. And that strikes me as a good way to be thinking about the neighbor in your world that is waiting to experience the love that springs forth from the hope that lives inside you. God has handpicked and orchestrated those He's put into your world. The people that God puts in your path, we need to see this for what it is. Assignments from God Himself. Be open to it, anticipate it, and be observant for it, watching for it. We need to be able to embrace those God puts into our lives. How are we to love our neighbors? The most basic and beautiful answer to this question comes in the gospel itself. In order for us to love our neighbor, we must first know how Jesus treated us as a neighbor. Jesus became our neighbor in the incarnation when the eternal Son of God became flesh and took up residence among us. Then He showed us the extent of neighborly love by coming not to be served, but to serve, demonstrating His love on the cross, removing our guilt and renewing us in love. And at this moment, He is in heaven preparing a place especially for us, that when He returns, we might forever be neighbors with Him. Loving our neighbor is about serving our neighbor. I'd like to share a story of my own neighbor experience. And this story takes place over a long period of time, and it started actually a long time ago. It started when I was walking down the side yard of my house and noticed some branches scattered on the ground. It was really puzzling. I couldn't figure out where these things came from, and as I looked at them carefully, I realized, well, these branches have been trimmed, and actually they've been trimmed off of my tree. And I knew I hadn't trimmed them, which only left one answer as to where they came from. My next door neighbor. Well, I collected the branches and put them in the composting bin, and I contemplated, how should I handle this? I was somewhat new to being a homeowner at the time, and my neighbor actually was pretty new to the neighborhood, and I didn't have an established relationship with him. My initial reaction to this situation was, to be honest, I was kind of annoyed. And then I started to feel insulted. I considered how I might confront him later about the situation, but I never acted on this. I made a small but important decision that I was going to figure out how to win over this person rather than have conflict and tension with him. And I consciously asked God to help me create a positive relationship with him. His name was John. I honestly can't remember how I started making contact with him. It was a long time ago, but I know that once I did, I found out that John did not like my maple trees. Like, not at all. He didn't like the way the maple trees dropped seeds and started seedlings in his yard because he had to pull them out. And he definitely didn't like my trees in the fall because they dropped a lot of leaves on his roof and in his gutters. He actually started a mini campaign with me about maybe it'd be a good idea to cut down some of these trees, at least a couple. Well, I like my trees. I didn't want to cut them down, but it did lead me to another crucial point. I made a conscious decision that I was going to offer to clean out his gutters every year. I honestly think that my gesture and willingness to undo some of the mess my trees created for his property was a strong turning point for John in our relationship. Once, especially, when he saw me follow through with my offer in the fall. And I continued in the years ahead. From there, John and I started to become friends. John was a World War II veteran, as well as having served in the Korean conflict and the Vietnam War. He was a retired Air Force colonel and had many stories which he was fond of sharing. John was truly an interesting person. John had written a book about being shot down with his crew and stranded out at sea. There was even a documentary film that was later made about this incident. I eventually invited John to my annual Christmas party with his wife, Jean. And sometimes we had meals together in our backyards. And there was that time when I was to replace my back deck, and John offered to help supervise since, one, he had some building experience, and two, he thought he saw me making some questionable choices. And I had never made a deck before. I was glad I allowed John into that process. It definitely helped our relationship and deepened it. John enjoyed sharing his knowledge with me. I definitely gathered something from it, but it also created a deeper relationship for us. As I look back, I can tell that my relationship with John didn't start out talking about God, but eventually that did become part of our relationship, where John was seeing what my life was about, and he was asking questions. Eventually, even though it wasn't something I pushed on him or even discussed early on, as I just described, John and Jean ended up wanting to come to church with us. And that became meaningful for them, not just socially, but also spiritually. And it was a natural outcome of our relationship as it progressed. My experience with John and Jean taught me a lot about being able to see the people that God puts in front of us. And even though it went on for a very long time, it's an example of creating meaningful relationships in a way that glorifies God. Love of God and love of neighbor are connected. We cannot love God rightly if we do not love our neighbors. And we cannot love our neighbors rightly if we do not love God. As we grow and mature in our sanctification, we must find ourselves loving both God and neighbor more and more. I challenge you to be open to opportunities with the people that God is placing in your life, and find ways to serve and love your neighbor. Goodbye, neighbor.